After my grandfather's historic farmhouse was seized by our power-hungry HOA for community use, they had no idea I'd just been appointed as the new federal historic preservation inspector. I never wanted trouble with Oakridge Estates HOA. I didn't, but when I found that official-looking letter in my mailbox with notice of community acquisition stamped across it in bold red letters, I knew this meant war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands were shaking as I read it. By unanimous board decision, the Dawson property at 1842 Heritage Lane has been designated for community use under HOA bylaw 47(3)(c). You have 90 days to vacate. This wasn't just any house they were trying to take. This was my grandfather's 1890s farmhouse, one of the last original structures in Oakridge County. The same farmhouse where I'd spent summers as a kid. The one I'd lovingly restored over the past 3 years since inheriting it. I watched through my kitchen window as Diane Patterson, our HOA president, parked her luxury SUV across the street. She stood there with her designer sunglasses, examining my property while speaking into her phone. This was the 4th time this week she'd been inspecting my house. "She's out there again," my wife Beth called from the living room. "Maybe we should just consider their buyout offer." "No," I said firmly, setting down my coffee mug. "This house has been in my family for 5 generations. They can't just take it because they want to build a new community center." What Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 2 weeks ago, I'd received another letter. This one came from the Department of the Interior, confirming my appointment as the new Federal Historic Preservation Inspector for our district. After 15 years working at the National Park Service, I'd finally landed the role I'd been working toward. I walked outside to collect my mail, purposely taking my time. Diane pretended to check her phone while watching me from the corner of her eye. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," she called out, her voice sickly sweet. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is, Diane. I trust you've received my formal objection to the HOA's acquisition notice." She waved her hand dismissively. "The board has reviewed your concerns, but our decision stands. This neighborhood needs a proper community center, and your property is the perfect location. And the fact that my house is one of the oldest in the county, that my grandfather's farm was here before Oakridge Estates even existed? Progress. Happens, Mike," she said with a tight smile. "Besides, we've had architectural consultants confirm the structure has no significant historical value." Little did she know, I had spent the past 2 weeks quietly compiling evidence of the home's historical significance. I'd also been documenting every irregularity in the HOA's procedures, every conflict of interest, every violation of state preservation laws. As Diane turned to leave, her expensive heels clicking on the sidewalk, she called over her shoulder, "Oh, and the board is calling a special meeting tonight, 7 p.m. sharp. We'll be finalizing the community center plans. You should attend, see what a wonderful asset it will be." I watched her walk away, then pulled out my phone to text my colleague at the county records office. "Need those property boundary documents ASAP. Diane's making her move tonight." Just then, my neighbor Tom Jenkins pulled into his driveway. I saw Diane stop to make notes on her clipboard. Tom had been fighting the HOA for months over unauthorized landscaping, native plants that required less water but didn't match the HOA's approved flora list. I went inside and spread the county maps across my desk, each historical property carefully marked. 3 years of research, of documenting the historical significance of not just my house, but the entire original settlement that predated Oakridge Estates. Tonight, Diane would learn that her biggest mistake wasn't just targeting my property, it was not doing her homework on exactly who she was dealing with. My phone rang. It was Tom, upset about another violation notice. As I listened to his story, I glanced at the framed photo on my wall. My grandfather, standing proudly in front of the farmhouse, the same house Diane now wanted to demolish for her vanity project. Grandpa had taught me to stand up for what's right, but to fight smart. I checked my watch. 6 hours until the meeting. Diane wanted to play hardball over a historic property. She had no idea what was coming. I walked into the community center's meeting room at precisely 6:55 p.m. The tension was palpable, every seat filled with neighbors I'd known for years, all whispering among themselves. Diane had really outdone herself this time. She'd even hired an architect to create stunning 3D renderings of her proposed community center, built right where my house currently stood. "Let's begin," Diane announced, tapping her gavel on the podium. She'd strategically scheduled this special meeting on a Tuesday evening, knowing most working families would struggle to attend. But I'd made sure to be there, sitting quietly in the back row, my federal credentials and documentation neatly organized in my briefcase. "As you can see from these beautiful renderings," she began, clicking through her PowerPoint presentation, "the new Oakridge Community Center will be the crown jewel of our neighborhood." A few enthusiastic claps came from her loyal followers in the front row, the same ones whose bylaw violations mysteriously disappeared whenever they volunteered for Diane's pet projects. I glanced around the room. Tom Jenkins was furiously taking notes. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, rolled her eyes as Diane described the much-needed upgrade to our community's image. Mrs. Rodriguez had been fined last month for having a wheelchair ramp that was not aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. Furthermore, Diane continued, pulling out a thick binder, "Our financial projections show that property values will increase by at least 15% once the old Dawson eyesore is replaced with this state-of-the-art facility." My blood boiled at hearing my lovingly restored home called an eyesore, but I kept my cool. Timing was everything. Moving on to the funding, Diane clicked to a new slide showing a budget breakdown. "We'll be implementing a special assessment of $2,500 per household to cover construction costs." Several neighbors gasped. That's when Sarah Miller, a single mum from Oak Street, stood up. "Diane, is this assessment really necessary? Some of us are already struggling with the recent HOA fee increases." "You're out of order," Diane snapped. "You haven't been recognized by the chair." I watched as Diane's husband Robert started, handing out copies of the final acquisition timeline, showing construction beginning in just 45 days, well before the 90-day notice period they'd given me. "We'll now vote to approve the final community center plans and special assessment," Diane declared, not even bothering to allow discussion. "All in favor?" That was my cue. I stood up slowly, straightening my tie. "Point of order, Madam President." Diane's eyes narrowed as she looked at me over her reading glasses. "You're not recognized, Mr. Dawson." "Actually," I said, pulling out my credentials, "according to federal regulation 36 CFR Part 800, any action affecting a potentially historic property requires proper review." The room fell silent. I could see Diane's perfectly manicured nails gripping the podium tighter. "Before we proceed with any vote," I continued, walking toward the front of the room, "I believe it's important to disclose that as of 2 weeks ago, I've been appointed as the Federal Historic Preservation Inspector for this district. I placed my official Department of the Interior identification on the projector so everyone could see it." Diane's face began to lose color. "And in that capacity, I've been conducting an official review of several properties in this area, including my own home, which preliminary findings indicate meets the criteria for the National Register of Historic Places." The room erupted in murmurs. Through my peripheral vision, I could see phones coming out, neighbors recording every moment of Diane's increasingly panicked expression. That's irrelevant," Diane stammered. "The HOA has full authority." "The HOA has No authority to override federal historic preservation statutes, I corrected calmly. Furthermore, I've discovered some concerning irregularities in the HOA's procedure. I pulled out several documents, laying them one by one on the table. For instance, the architectural consultants who declared my home had no historical value were not licensed to make such determinations. They were actually landscape designers from the same company building Diane's new pool, a clear conflict of interest. Gasps filled the room. Diane's husband rushed to the podium, whispering something in her ear. Her eyes widened as she finally realized the legal quagmire she'd created. Also concerning, I continued, is this property survey showing that the proposed community center would encroach on protected wetlands, a violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. I clicked through my own prepared slides, showing the original property boundaries, the historical significance documentation, and the federal protections that applied. Most troubling of all, I said, pulling out one final document, is this email chain between Mrs. Patterson and luxury living developers, dated 6 months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Discussing how securing my property would clear the final hurdle for their upcoming commercial development adjacent to our neighborhood. The room exploded. Neighbors jumped to their feet, demanding explanations. Diane tried to restore order by banging her gavel, but nobody was listening anymore. I moved to table all discussion of the community center project pending a full federal review, I announced. I second that motion, Tom Jenkins called out immediately. Soon hands were going up all around the room. Diane grabbed her designer and bag and started toward the door. This meeting is adjourned, she yelled. You'll be hearing from our attorneys. Actually, I said, still calm, according to HOA bylaw section 7.2, you need a majority vote to adjourn when a motion is on the floor, and I don't think you have that anymore. I gestured at the documents spread across the table. We're just getting started. In fact, I believe the FBI's Public Corruption Unit would be very interested in reviewing the HOA's financial records, particularly regarding that special landscaping fund that somehow paid for your vacation to the Bahamas last summer. Diane froze with her hand on the doorknob, her face ashen. 20 years of ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist were coming to an end. Now, I said, opening a folder containing County Preservation Society applications, let's talk about establishing this entire original settlement area as a protected historical district, which would make any HOA decisions subject to preservation review. The next few weeks transformed our neighborhood. A thorough audit revealed years of financial mismanagement. Diane resigned from the board, citing health concerns, though everyone knew the real reason was the pending federal investigation. The special assessment was cancelled, and for the first time in a decade, we held actual democratic HOA elections. 6 months later, I stood on my front porch, looking at the new bronze plaque designating my grandfather's farmhouse as a historic landmark. Children played freely in their yards without fear of violation notices for excessive recreational activity. Tom's native plant garden had become a model for water conservation in the neighborhood. Rather than being demolished, my home now hosted monthly historical society meetings in the very parlor where my grandfather used to tell me stories. The most satisfying moment came when the new HOA board voted to use the reserve funds, previously earmarked for Diane's community center, to establish a neighborhood grant program for historical home restoration. As I hammered the last nail into the historic designation sign, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from a neighborhood association in the next county over, asking for advice on dealing with their own power-hungry HOA president. I smiled, thinking about how sometimes standing up for what's right isn't just about saving your own home. It's about showing others how to protect theirs too. The best part: Diane's new lakeside condo had just been designated as part of a bald eagle protection zone, severely restricting her planned renovations. Sometimes karma works through the Federal Registry. As they say, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And as it turns out, I'm not just a homeowner, I'm a history expert. It's been a year since the dramatic HOA board meeting that changed Oakridge Estates forever. The neighborhood has transformed in ways I never imagined possible. Walking down Heritage Lane on a crisp autumn morning, I barely recognized the community that once lived under Diane Patterson's iron rule. The quarterly neighborhood picnic was in full swing at the community park, the same park that had been neglected for years while Diane funneled maintenance funds into her pet projects. Today, children played on new equipment, while their parents chatted over homemade dishes, a stark contrast to the suspicious glances neighbors once exchanged, always afraid of being reported for some minor violation. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Jenkins. "You're not going to believe who I just saw at the county records office." I smiled, imagining the possibilities. Ever since our victory, Tom had become the neighborhood's unofficial historian, documenting the area's rich past. I grabbed a cup of coffee and headed toward the central pavilion, where our new HOA board was hosting an informal meet and greet. What a difference from Diane's regime. No formal attire requirements, no assigned seating, no rehearsed presentations designed to intimidate, just neighbors talking to neighbors about genuine community concerns. "Mike, just the man I wanted to see," called out Margaret Chen, our new HOA president. A retired civil rights attorney, Margaret had moved to Oakridge 3 years ago and had been fighting Diane's discriminatory policies ever since. The Historical Society just approved our application for the educational grant. "We can start the restoration workshops next month." I beamed with pride. The historical home restoration workshops had been my idea, a way to help neighbors appreciate and maintain the original character of their homes while meeting modern building codes. More importantly, it was a way to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to anyone else in our community. "That's fantastic news, Margaret. Have you selected the first demonstration home yet?" "Actually," Margaret replied, lowering her voice, "that's what I wanted to discuss with you. We've received an unexpected application." She handed me her tablet, and I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw the name on the screen: Robert Patterson, Diane's husband. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, scanning the application details. Robert was requesting assistance in restoring their 1950s mid-century modern home, the same home where Diane had hosted her infamous board pre-meetings, where the real decisions were made before the public gatherings. "It gets better," Margaret said. "Read the personal statement section." I scrolled down to Robert's written explanation. "After recent personal changes, I've developed a new appreciation for our neighborhood's architectural heritage. What was once just a house to me now represents an important example of post-war suburban development that deserves proper preservation." "Recent personal changes," I repeated. "That's certainly one way to describe your wife being under federal investigation for embezzlement and fraud." Margaret shrugged. "People can change, Mike, especially when their spouse of 30 years files for divorce and moves to Phoenix." This was news to me. Diane left? When did this happen? "Last month, apparently. Robert's been keeping to himself, but Mrs. Rodriguez says she's seen him actually working in his yard for the first time in 20 years. Margaret checked her watch. "Speaking of Robert, he should be here any minute. He asked specifically if you would be attending today." I wasn't sure how to feel about this development. Part of me wanted to savor the satisfaction of seeing Robert humbled, forced to join the community he and Diane had lorded over. Another part wondered if this was some elaborate scheme, a way for the Pattersons to rebuild their reputation and influence. "Mike Dawson?" A hesitant voice came from behind me. I turned to find Robert Patterson standing there, looking nothing like the imposing figure who used to distribute Diane's violation notices with such smug authority. His designer polo was replaced by a simple button-down shirt. The expensive watch was gone. Even his posture seemed different, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "Robert?" I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Margaret tells me you've applied for the restoration workshop program." "Yes, I have," he replied, his eyes darting nervously to Margaret, then back to me. "I understand if the committee has reservations given my history with the neighborhood." Margaret tactfully excused herself, leaving us alone. An awkward silence stretched between us. "Would you like to take a walk?" I finally suggested, gesturing toward the park's perimeter path. Robert nodded gratefully. We walked in silence for several minutes, passing neighbors who did double takes at seeing us together. Finally, Robert spoke. "I owe you an apology, Mike, a massive one, to you and to everyone in Oakridge." I kept my pace steady, waiting for him to continue. For years, I told myself I was just supporting my wife, that I wasn't really involved in her methods. He sighed heavily. "But the truth is, I was complicit in everything. Every fine, every threat, every manipulation." We reached the small pond at the edge of the park. A family of ducks glided across the water, undisturbed by our presence. "Why the sudden change of heart, Robert? Is it because Diane left, or because the FBI confiscated your assets?" Robert winced but nodded. "Fair questions. The investigation was a wake-up call, certainly, but Diane leaving was inevitable. Our marriage had been just for show for years, a power partnership, not a relationship." He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the pond. "Did you know I used to be an architectural preservationist before I met Diane?" This surprised me. "No, I had no idea. I specialized in mid-century modern restoration, had my own small firm in Chicago. When we moved here 20 years ago, I gave it up because Diane thought it wasn't prestigious enough." He shook his head. "Somewhere along the way, I lost myself, started believing that power and status were more important than passion and integrity." I studied Robert's face, looking for signs of deception, but saw only exhaustion and regret. "The FBI agent who interviewed me, she asked me a question I haven't been able to shake. She said, 'Mr. Patterson, what would your younger self think of the man you've become?' I couldn't answer her. We completed our circuit of the pond, heading back toward the pavilion. "Why are you telling me all this, Robert?" He stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "Because you stood up to us when no one else would. Because you protected something valuable, not just for yourself, but for the entire community. And because..." He hesitated. "I found something in my home office that you should see." Robert pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to me. It was yellow with age, the corners frayed. I carefully unfolded it, a newspaper clipping from 1968. The headline read, "Local Farm Preservation Effort Succeeds." My breath caught as I recognized the black and white photo accompanying the article. My grandfather, standing with a group of community members in front of his farmhouse, the same house Diane had tried to seize. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was in Diane's opposition research files. She kept detailed information on everyone she considered a potential threat. But she never showed me this particular document." I scanned the article, my heart racing as I read, "Local farmer William Dawson successfully rallied community support to prevent county developers from seizing historic properties through eminent domain." Dawson, whose family has farmed the land since 1890, organized neighboring farmers to establish the Oakridge Historical Agricultural District, protecting over 200 acres from commercial development. And my grandfather started the original preservation effort, I murmured, pieces falling into place. This is why our homes were spared when the surrounding farms were developed into Oakridge Estates. Robert nodded solemnly. Diane knew. She knew your family was responsible for the preservation restrictions that prevented her from selling portions of the neighborhood to commercial developers. That's why she targeted your house specifically. It wasn't just about the community center. It was revenge for restrictions put in place 50 years ago. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I'd thought Diane's actions were simply about power and control. I never imagined there was a decades-long grudge at play. There's more, Robert said quietly. Look at the names of the other farmers who joined your grandfather's preservation effort. I scanned the list and froze when I saw it. Edward Patterson. Your father? I asked, looking up at Robert in disbelief. He nodded, swallowing hard. My father opposed the development that would have made my wife millions. The ultimate irony. Diane never knew she married into the very family that helped create the restrictions she fought against her entire career. The weight of this realization was staggering. Generations of connected history buried under years of HOA bylaws and property disputes. Robert, why show me this now? Because some cycles need to be broken, he replied simply. And because I want to restore more than just my house. I want to restore my father's legacy and my own integrity. In that moment, standing in the park our community had reclaimed, I saw Robert Patterson not as the enemy's husband, but as a man finding his way back to his authentic self. The satisfaction I'd felt in defeating Diane suddenly seemed hollow, compared to the possibility of genuine reconciliation and healing. The restoration workshop, I said finally. Your application, you were serious about that? Completely serious, Robert confirmed, though I understand if the committee feels I should be disqualified. I considered this for a moment, then made a decision. Actually, with your background in architectural preservation, I think you might be more valuable as an instructor than a participant. We could use someone with expertise in mid-century modern restoration. The hope that flickered across Robert's face was unmistakable. You'd consider that, after everything? Redemption has to start somewhere, Robert. I carefully refolded the newspaper clipping and handed it back to him. Keep this, maybe display it in your house, a reminder of your father's values. As we walked back to the picnic, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The victory over Diane had been satisfying, but this deeper understanding and potential for genuine community healing was far more meaningful. Later that evening, as I sat on my grandfather's porch, the porch that had almost been demolished, I pulled out his old journal. I'd read it countless times, but now I searched for mentions of Edward Patterson. There it was, on a dog-eared page from October 1968. Ed Patterson stood with us today when others wouldn't. He risked his standing with the developers to do what's right. That's the measure of a man, not what he does when it's easy, but the stand he takes when it costs him something. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the National Registry of Historic Places, official confirmation that our entire original settlement area had been granted protected status. Attached was a digital map showing the preserved zone, including both my grandfather's farmhouse and, ironically, the Patterson mid-century home. Some battles are won through confrontation, I realized. But the more important victories come through understanding our shared history and finding common ground. My grandfather hadn't just fought to save his own farm. He'd built alliances, even with unlikely allies, like Edward Patterson. The next morning, I called Robert and invited him to coffee. It was time to share what I'd found in my grandfather's journal. As I waited for him at the local cafe, I watched our neighbors greet each other warmly, without the fear and suspicion that had once permeated every interaction. This was the real victory, not just saving my house or exposing Diane's corruption, but rediscovering the community spirit that had protected Oakridge decades before any HOA existed. My grandfather and Robert's father had understood what we had temporarily forgotten. True community isn't built through rules and enforcement, but through shared purpose and mutual respect. Robert arrived, looking nervous but hopeful. I opened my grandfather's journal to the marked page and pushed it across the table. As he read his father's name, written in my grandfather's steady hand all those years ago, I saw the moment of recognition in his eyes, the same revelation I had experienced. Sometimes, to move forward, we need to understand where we came from. And sometimes, the most powerful realizations aren't about our enemies, but about the unexpected connections that bind us all together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.